Hello, my name is Nikki Small. This recording is one of a series that provides further guidance on the assessments for the 4 core units of the Foundation Certificate in People Practice. This recording focuses on CO04 Essentials of People Practice. Assessments are revised on a regular basis, and this guidance is based on the June 2023 version. The last moderation for this assessment is September 2024. Before we start to look at the assessment in detail, I wanted to explain how this unit differs to the other 3 units in the Foundation Certificate. It's a bigger unit. There are more credits than the other units, and for that reason, there's a higher overall word count. This assessment is split into 5 tasks. Centres set submission dates, and they can do this by task, or they can group tasks together, or they can require learners to submit the whole assignment. Word count must not be exceeded by more than 10%, as is the case in other units. But because this unit is so much bigger, the potential risk of exceeding word count is perhaps higher. So the best way to manage word count is to manage it by task, and so long as each task doesn't exceed more than 10% of the word count for that task, then the overall word count should be absolutely fine too. If a centre chooses to allow students to submit one task at a time, then they should be mindful that whatever is submitted for moderation should be one document, with the exception of the recording and the skills observation feedback form in task 2 that we'll have a look at shortly. The whole assessment is based around a case study of an organisation called Clean Quarter Limited, and you're provided with a little bit of information about the organisation right at the beginning of the assessment. Some further pieces are added that relate to each task, but there's some key things to take account of in the general information. The first is that it's a small startup business, and that's important to bear in mind when some of the tasks are completed. Because it's a small business, it's not running yet, it's about to start, so finances could be tight. Task 1 asks learners to produce some written advice, and this means that learners should produce a written answer that addresses each assessment criteria separately. Overall, there's 1,500 words for task 1, which is around 250 words per assessment criteria. However, there's part of this task that's excluded from the word count. The letters of appointment and non-appointment that will be produced are excluded from the word count. The letters should be produced as part of a single submission. They shouldn't be produced as separate documents. And the submission should include headings that make it clear where each question has been answered. So, for example, the question and the assessment criteria reference should be copied and pasted into a separate document, and then the answer produced underneath. Then it's very clear to everyone where a particular question has been addressed. However, the title, if you like here, the question itself and the assessment criteria are not included in the word count. Now, in later tasks, such as the information sheet, headings are included in the word count because headings form part of the information sheet. So this part is just a little bit different. We'll now move to the questions in the assessment brief. For the purpose of this presentation, I've given each question a number, but they appear as bullet points in the assessment brief. We'll start with question number 1. Here you're asked to show some knowledge and understanding of the employee life cycle. It's important to manage word count, so it's not possible to write extensively about each stage in the employee life cycle. You'll have a chance to do this in later questions. Here, all you need to do is show that you understand what the life cycle is, what the key stages are, and think about the role of people professionals at different stages in the life cycle. After question 1, you're provided with a little bit more information, and that helps to position the questions that then follow in task 1, but also task 2. It also emphasises that this is a small business because they are employing 3 sales assistants, whereas a larger business might be looking to employ many more people. Question 2 asks you to explain the purpose and key content of a job description and person specification. So it's important to address each of those separately rather than try and combine them, because the documents have a different purpose, even though they may be produced as a single document in reality in organisations, and they may be called something different, such as a role profile. So here, learners need to address the question explicitly, making sure that a job description and a person specification are covered, and then move on to have a look at how job analysis can be used to decide what actually goes into those documents. There's no requirement to create a job description or a person specification or carry out a job analysis. Question number 3 asks you to explain 2 recruitment methods that Jaspreet and Caroline could use for the sales assistant vacancies, and to then explain why those 2 methods are appropriate for the role. One of the first things to do is decide which 2 recruitment methods will be included in the answer. So it's important to think about what would be suitable for this role, sales assistants, in this organisation. There may be some methods that are perhaps less suitable than others. So it's all about tailoring advice to this particular context. Question number 4 asks learners to explain factors to consider when deciding on the content of copy used in the recruitment methods you have explained above, because in the assignment brief it's listed above. So whichever 2 recruitment methods have been written about, then consideration needs to be given as to what would be included within that recruitment method. And the question gives a few tips. So budget, getting that balance between an accurate image but a positive image, the amount of space available that's in that particular recruitment method, and the kind of corporate image that an organisation might want to present. But you may also want to think that this organisation, it's new, it's a startup, it's not a well-known brand. That might be a factor to consider too. Whichever factors are chosen, they should be explained so it's clear that you understand why those are important factors to consider for this vacancy in this organisation. Question number 5 is asking you to explain 2 different selection methods that Jaspreet and Caroline could use for the same vacancies, and why those methods are appropriate for the role. This is similar to the question about recruitment methods, but it's important not to confuse recruitment and selection methods. So recruitment methods are used to attract candidates or attract a pool of applications, whereas selection methods allow organisations to select candidates from those who've applied for the position. Again, you need to think about this role in this organisation rather than provide a generic response to this question. Question number 6 asks learners to explain the selection records that Clean Quarter Limited should keep and why they should keep those. Because it's asking about records in plural, it's important to include a range and to explain why they should be retained. It's up to learners to decide how many to include. They may include a larger number with a bit less detail or a smaller number and provide greater depth, but a range must be included. If referring to legislation, it's important to use capital letters appropriately. I put an example here of the Data Protection Act 2018, and each key word in the name of the legislation starts with a capital letter. Question number 7 is a much more practical task. It's the last question in task 1. And due to the nature of this task, there's no need to try to use referencing. It's possible to get a 4 for this if the quality of the answer is good without any references within it. This task is an individual task, and if task 2, which we'll come on to in a minute, is completed as a panel, it's important that the letter writing activity in task 1 is carried out individually. When writing the letters, normal letter writing conventions should be followed, including the address of a space for the address of the business, a space for the address of the person to whom the letter is being sent, the date and who the letter is to, followed by the content, and then a normal sign off with an opportunity for a signature and a name, etc. We now move to task 2. Task 2 is a practical task. The evidence that's being submitted for this task is a little bit different to the others because of the nature of the task itself. There's 3 key things that will be submitted. The selection criteria that are devised, we'll come on to that in a minute. It's not included in the word count. The notes from shortlisting candidates against the selection criteria. Again, it's not included in the word count, but has to be submitted. And then a video recording of the interview needs to be available too. Now, depending on the centre, it might be the centre themselves who undertake that video recording, or it might be the responsibility of the learner, but that has to be retained. And any of the words that are used in that interview are not included in the word count for the whole assignment. It's important that the video recordings are retained, and if selected for moderation, they have to be submitted along with all of the other documents. And learners should be identified by name in the recording. So learners could introduce themselves as part of the interview. That might be a way of doing it. Or each person could say who they are before the interview starts. There's different ways of doing that. A skills observation feedback form should be completed for each learner, which provides them with detailed feedback on their performance within the interview. And they should be completed whether the interview is a panel interview or an individual interview. And panels should have no more than 3 panel members in them. So we'll move into the detail now of task 2. Question number 1 asks learners to devise selection criteria for the post of sales assistant using the job description already written, Appendix A. The job description is provided, and learners then have to think about the kind of duties and responsibilities that are included in the job description and think, what does somebody need to know or be able to do, or in order to do that job. So what knowledge is needed, what skills, experience, behaviours, etc. are needed to perform that particular job. Then, using Appendix B of the assessment brief, the criteria that are chosen should be recorded, and each of the candidates should be rated against that shortlist. So the candidate information is provided through application forms that are issued as part of the assessment. So as mentioned earlier, there's no need to include any evidence of references to get at a 4 for assessment criteria 2.2. Question number 2 is a very practical activity where an interview is carried out. So whoever has been selected as suitable for interview through the shortlisting process will be interviewed. If more than one candidate is identified as suitable for interview, there's no need to carry out more than one interview. So only one interview should be carried out. If working as part of a panel, it's essential that each member of that panel actively takes part in shortlisting, interviewing, and decision making. So the start is to plan the structure of the interview, what's going to be covered, who is going to do which part, who's going to open the interview, who's going to ask the first question, who will ask the next question, etc., who's going to close the interview. So there should be some kind of an equal split so that each person can be assessed. And there's no requirement for any kind of referencing in this task either. We now move to task 3, and you're provided with a little bit more information that adds to the information that was provided at the start of the assessment. And here you're being told that Jaspreet and Caroline are just starting to think a little bit more about employment relations, and they've asked you to write a guidance document, and the word count here is approximately 1,250 words. So question 1 in task 3 asks you to explain the importance of achieving work-life balance within the employment relationship with an overview of legislation relevant to work-life balance. So this has got 2 parts to it, even though it doesn't say "and" within the question. A good start is to explain the importance of work-life balance, to then move on and think about legislation that's relevant to work-life balance. Because of the word count, it's not going to be possible to write extensively about lots of different pieces of legislation. Instead, the key points of the legislation should be written about with a clear understanding shown of how that links to work-life balance. So there's a nice connection between the first part of the question and the second part, answer rather. Question 2 is asking for an explanation of what well-being is and an explanation of the importance of well-being. So again, 2 little parts to this question, but the word "and" is a good indicator there that there are the 2 parts. Again, it's good to start off by thinking about the term and what it means to then move to the second part of the question. Question 3 potentially could be quite a big answer, but it's asking for a summary of the main points of discrimination legislation. It's not asking for a comprehensive coverage of all points of discrimination legislation. So a summary should be provided rather than lengthy detailed descriptions. And it's crucial to refer to relevant up-to-date legislation. Within this answer, it's important to use your own words. That's important in any answer because it's the learner that's being assessed rather than a reproduction of what someone else has written. But we've seen through a variety of moderation windows that there seems to be a higher risk of copying and pasting information about legislation compared to some of the other topics that are used in assignments. A good starting point is to have a look at what the legislation is and what it covers. But then it's useful to put that aside where it can't be seen anymore, and a unique answer can then be written in response to this question. Question number 4 is another two-parter asking for an explanation of what diversity and inclusion mean, and then secondly, why they are important. It's important to show understanding of both the terms diversity and inclusion because they have different meanings. At the beginning, it works well to explain what each term is. You could, as you explain each term, explain why it's important, or you could explain the terms and then separately as a second part to the answer, the importance could be covered. That's a matter for preference, really. Question number 5 asks for an explanation of the difference between fair and unfair dismissal. It can be useful to explain terms before moving on to look at differences. Relevant legislation can be cited in this answer, and in trying to explore differences in a bit more detail, the differences in risk between a fair and unfair dismissal could be explored. But what's key is that an appreciation of the differences emerges in the answer. We now move to task 4, where again you're provided with a little more information. Here you're asked to provide a briefing paper to provide Jaspreet and Caroline with essential information and understanding of performance management and reward. So the topic has shifted now, and task 4 has approximately 1,500 words allocated to it. Question number 1 of task 4 asks for an explanation of the purpose and components of performance management. Again, there's a two-parter here. So it's important to address both parts of the question. In explaining the key components of performance management, you should be showing what it includes. Question number 2 asks for an explanation of the main factors that need to be considered when managing performance. So again, it's not all factors, it's main factors. And the word count is going to constrain this answer in the way that it's constrained some of the others. It's not enough to list the factors, and there's some examples here, such as level of skill and competency, level of motivation, etc. Whichever factors are selected for inclusion in the answer, it's important that those are explained. So in explaining them, consideration can be given as to why those factors are important. Question number 3 asks for an explanation of different methods of performance review. In order to answer this question, a decision has to be made about what methods are going to be included. It's asking about different methods, so more than one should be included. There's some examples here, such as appraisal, 360-degree feedback as part of appraisal, continuous review, perhaps versus a traditional annual appraisal, formal reviews as opposed to informal conversations. Whichever methods are chosen, each should be explained. Question 4 asks for an explanation of the key components that are required to achieve an effective total reward system. And financial and non-financial components should be included. That's a bit of a tip, really, to show that there's quite a broad range of components that could be included. Question number 5 asks for an explanation of the relationship between reward and performance and the links to motivation. So some awareness should be shown of how reward can be used to encourage performance standards. When writing about motivation, there's an opportunity to consider how intrinsic and extrinsic rewards can be used to motivate. And of course, relevant motivation theory can be cited in this answer too. Question 6 asks for an explanation of at least 2 reasons for treating employees fairly in relation to pay. It's possible to write about more than 2, but at least 2 should be included. Given the word count restrictions, 2 is probably, going with 2 is probably a good decision. I've got some examples here on the slide that are all suitable. For instance, protection against equal pay claims, complying with minimum legal standards, but it's not enough just to list the reasons, they should be explained. So if compliance with legal minimum standards is picked, you've got to think, well, why is that an important reason for treating people fairly? What happens if those standards aren't complied with? We might now move to the 5th and final task, where again you're provided with a little more information. The attention has now shifted to learning and development. Jaspreet and Caroline are imagining they're going to provide an induction and ongoing learning and development to their employees, but they would like to develop their own knowledge of learning and development first, and you decide to prepare a fact sheet for them. You have approximately 1,250 words for the fact sheet. And as with the other tasks, you need to allocate a sufficient number of words to each assessment criteria. It is useful to work out what the average word count would be for each assessment criteria. But you may find that some questions would take a few more words, some a few less. If you're quite a bit under that average, there's a good chance you haven't covered that particular criteria in sufficient detail. We'll look now at the first question in task 5, and here you have to explain why learning and development activities are of benefit to the sales assistant and to the organisation Clean Quarter Limited. It's important to address both. So this does take a little bit of planning to make sure that the words are used effectively. There's some examples here on the slide about increasing skills and knowledge to transfer that into the work that the sales assistants do, could enhance their behaviours, could improve communication, etc. So you need to think, well, why are learning and development activities of benefit to the sales assistants, and then move to think about Clean Quarter. Whichever is selected, they should be explained. You need to explain why they're beneficial. It's unlikely to be possible to write about all of those, and you may have some other ideas of your own as well. So it's important to think which are going to be included. Question 2 of task 5 asks learners to describe different types of learning needs and reasons why they arise for the sales assistants and Clean Quarter Limited. So here you're again thinking very specifically about this organisation in the assessment brief rather than any organisation. And there's a whole range of different learning needs that might arise and reasons why they might arise. Once you've decided which to write about, it's important to have sufficient detail about each of those. Again, there's a number of examples that are given on the slide here, and it's about thinking, well, what might be appropriate in this particular context? Question number 3 asks for a summary of different face-to-face and blended learning and development approaches, including facilitation, training, coaching, and mentoring. So that means that each of those 4 areas, facilitation, training, coaching, and mentoring, must be included, and they must be written about separately. Don't try and combine them. There's a risk then that you don't fully meet this assessment criteria. A summary of different approaches is needed, and it's all that can be done in the word count, given that there's 4 areas that need to be covered. And face-to-face and blended learning needs to be covered some way as well in the answer. If anything is missed out, then that assessment criteria isn't addressed. So if it's a great answer, but it doesn't include coaching, then unfortunately, that answer would be given a mark of 1. Question number 4 asks for an explanation how in the delivery and design of learning and development initiatives, individual requirements and preferences must be accommodated. So here you could start by thinking about requirements and preferences that could arise. There's many different examples that could be included, but crucially, an explanation of how those needs can be accommodated must be included. It's not enough just to write about what they are. Question 5 asks learners to discuss 2 methods of evaluating learning and development and its impact. So at least 2 methods of evaluating L&D must be picked. Any 2 methods could be chosen, and then a discussion should take place of those. You could think about maybe models of evaluation. There's quite a lot of literature on models that have been developed by different writers or researchers. And as part of that, you could think about how feedback could be gathered as part of evaluation. So that brings us to the end of the tasks and to the questions within the tasks. And I wanted to end almost where we began, talking about word count. It is harder to manage as it's a larger unit, and it's definitely easier to manage by task. If submitting in stages, authenticity statements should be completed for each part of the submission. If a study centre requires the submission as a whole document for all the tasks, then obviously 1 authenticity statement is sufficient. Each task should be presented in the required format. So if it's asking for a briefing paper should be provided. If a fact sheet is asked for, a fact sheet should be provided. And lastly, don't forget to access the appendices for task 2. They're absolutely crucial in order to complete task 2 correctly. We have now reached the end of the webinar. Thank you for listening. Webinars are available for other units of the Foundation Certificate in Personnel Practice.